All right. Well, hello, friends. Welcome back to SerenityOS office hours. Hopefully everything works. It usually does. It is Friday, so we are going to do what we always do on Fridays, which is to talk about SerenityOS. If you're new to the stream, you can ask anything about the SerenityOS project and related projects, and we will just talk about it, dig into it. Technical, non-technical, anything goes. And that's the basic idea. What's up, Milan, Benjamin, and WK? WK, that's a short name, but a nice name nonetheless. Nice to see everybody here. I think we usually have to wait a bit for people to drop in, but it's no different than other Fridays. Let's see. Oh, Jessica Hamilton is asking a technical question right away. Are you able to talk about how Futexes were implemented in Serenity, the kind of changes that were needed to support them? Sure. So Futexes have gone through a series of iterations in Serenity. I think I wrote the first version of them, which was pretty bad, as I recall. It was not very complete. And it was really only to support like a single use case. And then other people worked on it and added stuff like cross-process synchronization and using shared memory Futexes and stuff like that, which we then removed because they were not actually used. And I don't actually know the state of the Futex at the moment. But basically, I think the changes that we needed to support them were contained to the one syscall. Let me see if I can find it. Why is this window so tiny? Where is the Futex? Oh, here it is. Oh, I had regex search on. Right, so I think if I understand the current implementation correctly, it's basically constrained to the Futex syscall, and the cross-process Futex stuff needed some stuff in the memory management system. So VM objects had to be aware of Futexes that were sort of monitoring an area inside of them. That's what I remember about that. But did you have a specific question about how they work? Basically, the way that I built the first version was I just looked at the API they have in Linux and then essentially doing like man Futex, and then implemented sort of, and just did an implementation of what they described here. And damn, that was so long ago. I feel like I should remember this better. When the heck did we do that? Anyways, what's up, Idan, Jack, Ivan, TRBRY? Now I'm just waiting to get to the bottom of this thing. Okay, when did we do Futexes? Did I do Futexes? Yes, Naive Futex, December 2019. So it's been a while. Okay, so we did that for pthread condt first. Okay, so it was for condition variables. Interesting. I think Idan, who is here, evidently, has done, or at least worked on, the most recent version of our Futexes. So Idan is probably one of the better people to ask about this. But if you have a question about how something specifically works, then we can look into it as well. Yanis, Lucas, Yepidev, what's up? Fred Lecky says, for heavily spec'd behaviors like HTML, CSS, JavaScript parsing, etc., where is the one correct behavior, or where there is one correct behavior? Is there ever a good reason to stray from the spec? That's a really good question. Yes, there is one very good reason to stray from the spec when it comes to web content and web specifications in particular. It's when the spec says one thing, but all the other browsers do something else, which happens. And if all the other browsers do something, that means that the actual web content out in the wild is going to expect what the browsers do, not what the spec says, right? And in cases like that, you want to do what other browsers do, not what the spec says, because you can feel high and mighty that you are following the spec, but if nobody else does, then it's kind of hollow, right? Because the websites are not going to work in your engine. So that is like the one reason where it's totally clear, at least to me, that you have to do what other people do, not what the spec says. And also in cases like that, that's arguably a spec bug. So if you find a situation where like existing browsers disagree with the spec in behavior, then the spec should be fixed in many cases. And then I think there are also other cases where not necessarily violating the spec, but doing something that's not in the spec or doing things in a different way can be very beneficial in terms of performance. So maybe the spec will suggest that you implement an algorithm using like a very naive sequence of steps that end up using a lot more memory because it's written in a naive way. And if you can think of a smarter way that uses less resources, even though it's not what the spec says you should do, as long as the outcome is the same, then that's a perfectly fine violation as well, or a perfectly fine reason to stray from the spec, not violate the outcome, but to stray. What's up, Brian? And I don't know how to say this. Is it True KS or Troy KS? I'm gonna go with Troy KS. Ole, all the nice waves and everything. And then Edan is elaborating on Futex stuff, saying the latest new feature we added to Futex is cross-process Futexes. Is that Futeces? Cross-process Futexes for cross-process named semaphore support. Since shared VM objects are already deduplicated in Serenity, we are simply able to use the VM object itself to support that, in case you're wondering how cross-process works. Indeed. Okay, yeah, so we have named semaphores. I think, was that added for like LLVM or something like that? I don't think we use named semaphores ourselves anywhere. Let's see. The woo-woo says, could you go briefly on LibJS, LibWeb internals, and their role in the browser? I don't know anything about browsers. Consider me as a user, please. Sure. So the role of the role of LibJS and LibWeb in the browser, whether you're running it on Linux like I am now or in SerenityOS, the LibWeb is basically responsible for everything inside of this white rectangle here that has Google in it. So LibWeb downloads the HTML, the JavaScript, the CSS, it parses all that stuff, and it doesn't parse the JavaScript, that's for LibJS, but LibWeb and LibJS together, they handle everything in the white rectangle. So they parse all the inputs, they build a DOM tree, they build all the style sheet data structures, they run the CSS selectors against the DOM tree, and construct a layout tree, and figure out like where all the text should be, where all the images should be, stuff like that, and maintains all these data structures that allow you to see and interact with the web page. And the browser application is sort of a shell around LibWeb, but LibWeb and LibJS is where all of the implementation of the web specifications live. And that's sort of the high level overview. And the separation of LibJS and LibWeb is that LibJS is really just an implementation of the ECMAScript language. And LibWeb is the biggest client of LibJS, but LibJS is also usable standalone if you just want to embed JavaScript in your application. So we do use LibJS in other apps like Spreadsheet or Assistant, which have sort of built-in code execution capabilities as well. So that's sort of very briefly on what those things are. Sim in France says, how does thread locking work in Serenity? I suspect it is at an OS level. If it isn't, shouldn't it be? What does thread locking mean in that context? We have thread blocking, which means that a thread sort of decides that, okay, well, I can't execute anymore until some external event happens, which can be like, I'm waiting for somebody else to give up a lock, or I need to go to sleep for a few seconds, or I'm trying to read something from the disk, but the disk is busy, so I gotta wait until it's available. There are all kinds of reasons for a thread to block. One of them is that you might take a lock, but there are many other reasons as well. And the way thread blocking works in the kernel is that there is a function called block on the thread class, and you use it like this. So let's find a fun one, like Futex, like we just talked about. So you can call block on the current thread, and then you pass as a template argument, you pass in the type of block you want to perform. So in this case, we're blocking on a Futex, and then we provide some configuration here, configuration arguments for the Futex blocker. So a Futex blocker in this case needs to know which Futex queue you're blocking on, and a whatever this thing is. I don't actually know. But the different types of blocking, there are different conditions for waking up again, right? And all of those are implemented by these things called blockers. So if we look for public blocker, we can find a bunch of them. Here's the join blocker, which happens when you try to join another thread. Then we block using a join blocker, which will then wake you up again once that other thread has been joined. And then we have wait queue blocker, Futex blocker, and there are all kinds of file blockers, like read blocker, write blocker, and so on. I'm not exactly sure what you meant by thread locking, but all of this stuff is in the kernel, so it's absolutely happening at a kernel level. Troy KS says it's pronounced Troix. All right, Troix then. What's up, Sophia? What's up, Brandon? Okay, let's see. Benjamin was asking, in line with Fred's question, how do you see engine-specific CSS features like WebKit prefix properties, etc., being handled in LibWeb? Is it possible to make everyone happy, or would that be too much work? So I think it's already the case that some CSS specifications already say that you have to support WebKit prefix properties. I've seen in at least one spec that they're saying like, oh yeah, and you also have to support dash WebKit dash whatever as an alias for these properties. So, you know, despite the original intent of vendor-specific properties was supposed to be like a temporary thing that would live in a specific browser, it became so pervasive on the web that they've now worked their way into specifications, some of them. So it's a little bit goofy, but following that, it's kind of obvious that we also need to support many of the foreign vendor-specific properties. So we do have to support some WebKit properties. I think we already do for some things. Like we support dash WebKit, progress bar, and progress value. And there might be more things. Yeah, WebKit linear gradient. I think we support that one as well. And that might be one of the ones that's in the spec, actually. I forget where that would be. Okay, maybe that's not the right way to search for that. Linear gradient. I feel like I've seen that in the specification. No, maybe it's not. Okay. Anyway, but yeah, like so many websites use WebKit linear gradient and they don't have a plain linear gradient fallback property. So in that case, we have two options, right? Like we can ignore the WebKit linear gradient and just not look like you would expect, or we can support the property and, you know, it's a little bit janky, but the site ends up looking better. So it seems to me that it's better to do what's necessary to look proper than to sort of be overly dogmatic and say like, oh, well, if you're not going to use the specification properties, we're not going to display you correctly. But I guess that's not really what I would have said when I was 18 years old and cared a lot about W3C validation and things like that. But in practical terms, as an adult, I'm far more pragmatic than I was when I was younger. All right. By the way, I hope the microphone is doing better this time. Last office hours, it was a bit of a crap show. As it turned out, I had some weird software that had cranked up the input volume way past unamplified. So that's what was causing the goof last time. Okay, sounds good. That's very good. Benjamin also said, one of the WebKit prefixes that doesn't work everywhere is for styling scroll bars, where Firefox is annoying, with almost all browsers just being WebKit based now. Yeah, we don't support the WebKit scroll bar styling properties. We could, I guess, but styled scroll bars feel like kind of a very ancient thing in the first place. But I guess if there's some website that looks absolutely wrong without them, then if you could show us that, that would be good. And, you know, at least on the Mac, I don't know about... No, it's here as well. Like in Firefox, they have this type of scroll bar where it sort of goes away if you're not interacting with it. So if I put the mouse cursor over it, then it becomes big. If I put it nearby, it's small. And if I stay away for too long, then it just fades out. There are a bunch of interesting benefits to that approach to scrolling as well, especially that you don't have to deal with unstable layouts caused by introducing a scroll bar that then changes the available width in the window. That's actually a problem we have in our browser. What we do is when you're looking at a website, like say about blank, right? It has, does that actually load? It doesn't load. Where do we want to go? Like SerenityOS.org. So here, if we make the window big enough that it can fit the whole page, then the scroll bar goes away. And then if we make it a bit smaller, so we need a vertical scroll bar shows up. And when the scroll bar shows up, it takes up some amount of horizontal space. And because we take away horizontal space, that means that we have to relay out the page because the amount of available space is now different, right? So it's the classic GUI problem. And then there's this unfortunate thing that can happen where like you take away some space and then with the new layout, it's not tall enough that you need the scroll bar anymore. So you take away the scroll bar and now you end up in this loop of layouts, which is stupid. And having this overlay scroll bar just removes that problem. So it is kind of attractive to me to look for something like that. But at the same time, scroll bars are also very visually informative. So it does feel like you lose something with Firefox when you can't visually gauge like quickly where are you on the page, right? Although I guess their compromise is that if you just hover over the page in any way, then they show like this little hint outline of the scroll bar. So could be something we could consider. Anyways, let's drop that and see what else people were asking about. NK was asking, can you give some updates on multi-core support of Serenity? So multi-core support, I don't know that it's changed much in the last couple of weeks. I haven't seen anybody doing significant work on that. The main thing that I see going on in the kernel recently is Liav is working on reorganizing the proc and sys file systems. And Timon and Gunnar have been working on AArch64 support and trying to get us up and working on ARM64 computers, basically. So that's looking interesting, but I haven't seen anything towards multi-core specifically. So the state is essentially where it's been, I think, which is better than ever, but still some instabilities. Which means that we're not making it the default yet because it's a little bit too unstable for that. Let's see. Shamtown says, how can I perform system calls in assembly in Serenity? Thinking of porting Golang, which uses raw system calls to accomplish cross-platform operations. My understanding is that Golang, so we have the same syscall limitations as OpenBSD does. And my understanding is that they made changes to Golang to accommodate the syscall validation mechanism in OpenBSD. So whatever they did for OpenBSD, you should be able to do exactly the same way for us, because we implement the same type of mechanism where only blessed area of memory is allowed to call the kernel. So look at what Golang does for OpenBSD syscalls, and you should find something that works for us as well. Undefined says, any tips on debugging browser layout issues? My number one tip is to make the smallest possible page that shows the layout issue you want to look at. So if you can get it down to like 3 lines of HTML and CSS, that's ideal, because the less distractions, the better. And sometimes I spend hours in a day just reducing big web pages down to a handful of lines, and it's so much easier to debug tiny isolated versions of problems than it is to debug them in their original context. And then when it comes to debugging layout issues in general, I guess some other tips would be like, put borders around everything, give colors to everything. And it really depends on which layout module you are debugging, because they all work a bit differently from each other. So it's something I'm actually working on recently, making some kind of, I don't know, like an architectural guide to LibWeb layout. And I have a presentation about that I'm working on, and I'm just going to make into a video when it's finished, and maybe also make available as documentation so that we can update it. And then if you have specific stuff that you're trying to debug right now, then talking about it in Discord is a very good way to get input on what might be wrong as well. Let's see. Shamtown says, does Serenity have its own brand of assembly? No, it does not. We just use regular old Intel x86 assembly on x86 platforms, and AArch64 assembly on those platforms. We don't have our own hardware platform, and we don't have our own assembler program either. We use the whatever comes with the compiler in our tool chain, basically. Let's see. MSC. Okay, the initials. Let's do this. MSCLRHD says, theming of form elements like select, dropdown, checkbox, etc. are one of the missing features that proliferate custom controls. It makes it difficult to have a website UI look consistent. Yeah, it's a tricky thing, because on one hand, like websites I don't know what I prefer. Like I keep going back and forth on this. Like, do I want websites to have complete control over form elements, or do I want my form elements to look like native operating system form elements that look and behave like anything else on the system, so it's unambiguous what it is? And there's like pros and cons to both options, and it's that I can never figure out which one is better. Because the unambiguous nature of native controls is nice in that it's unambiguous and it's clear and you know exactly what things are and what to expect. But they look out of place, and you take away control from the author of the website who had a specific appearance in mind, and sometimes it breaks layout if you don't obey how they tell you to style the controls and so on. So it's a frustrating issue. But at the end of the day, I think we probably end up doing what the website author wants rather than at least within limits. Because if we break layouts and look too awkwardly wrong, then that's not good either. I don't know. I gotta think more about this. Fikisar says, is Ladybird on SerenityOS or another project? Ladybird is sort of the high-level name of the whole browser project at this point. So the Ladybird application at the moment is the cute UI for the LibWeb and LibJS engines, but it's also the name that we use to identify the web engine when we send out our user agent string. And I think over time, like, we are converging, the code bases are converging slowly. So there's more and more code sharing between the SerenityOS browser and the Ladybird Qt browser. And hopefully over time, the delta between the different platform specific parts of the browsers will shrink and become, it will become one code base in the end that has some platform specific parts, of course, but share everything that doesn't have to be platform specific. But today they are two separate repositories, two separate executables, two separate applications. But over time they will unite. Edon says that Quaker and Black Cat are also chipping away at USB support. That's true. That is, I've seen that. That's great. Sorry for forgetting about that. Let's see. Your Fab Cat, your favorite cat, says Serenity has many different pointer types. What is the difference between them? Especially the non-nullable stuff. So we have a page in the repository that talks about each of our pointer types and what they are for. And it's called smartpointers.md. And I will link that to you so that you can consume it at your leisure. But basically, we do have a bunch of different pointers. They are all there so that you don't have to use raw pointers and step into the typical C programming traps where you have leaks and use after freeze and things like that. Let's see. Jason L says, have you ever been offered funding by a large corporation for Serenity? I have not, but I have had venture capital people trying to hook up with me or contact me, or from various VC firms wanting to talk about things, but I have yet to meet with anyone from that industry. I just don't really feel like I don't want to take a big chunk of money from anybody, really, in exchange for influence over anything that I do. I really, really like the setup that we have going here, that I have going, where hundreds of people give a little bit of donation instead of one big actor giving a big donation or even a big investment in exchange for equity or in something or whatever. I don't want any of that. If I can have the many small contributions and make a a humble but healthy living that way, then I'm perfectly happy. And yeah, that's that's why I haven't taken any of the VC meetings. I mean, I don't even actually know what they want or what they think that we could do together. I just don't feel like that's something I need to invite into my life. Let's see. M9 says, can you name the window manager or another major app on Serenity Firefly? You can do that locally in your clone of Serenity, but in the main system, it's called Window Server. And Serenity has nothing to do with the TV show or movie of the same name, as I'm sure you've figured out by now. I have nothing against it, but it's just not, there's no connection there other than the name. Let's see. The literal definition of bruh says, if you don't mind, could you show us some of your CSS progress this week? It's really satisfying to see things like Twitter look closer and closer to other engines. Sure. So this week, I have not been doing as much layout as previous weeks. I was working on garbage collection a lot this week. And some of the new stuff is that a whole bunch of more things are managed by the garbage collector now. Stuff like the layout tree, which is sort of the secondary representation or the second representation of the DOM and CSS tree, which ends up what we paint on screen. All of that stuff, all of the layout information is now garbage collected as well. And browsing contexts are garbage collected. Browsing context is roughly like a frame, like an iframe or the top level frame. And we were doing all of that to eventually get to the point where we can collect some frickin' garbage, because we've been working on this browser for a long time, and we've been leaking like every page that you go on. When you click on a link and go somewhere else, that old page stays around in memory still forever. We just leak it because we had things pointing at each other in confusing ways, and the garbage collector was like, all right, I guess everything has to stay alive because I can't figure out what's dead, even though stuff was clearly dead. So this week I've been working a lot on making things garbage collected rather than reference counted, because then it allows the garbage collector to clearly identify, like, okay, so these things may point to each other, but nothing points to them, so it is garbage. And the end result of this is that now simple websites can actually be garbage collected after going out of view. So if I reload this page here, for example, a bunch of times, and I do a garbage collection, we can see that before reloading 5 times, I had about 23,000 live garbage collector objects, and I still have 23,000 something garbage collected objects, even after reloading 5 times. A week ago, if you reloaded 5 times, you would have had 5 times the amount of stuff simplified. But yeah, stuff didn't go away. And there's still a ton of cases where things don't go away. We have to figure all of those out. But for simple sites that don't do a lot of complicated things, we can now actually garbage collect them, which is very satisfying. But for sites like Twitter, or even for JavaScript benchmarks like SunSpider, they still accumulate a lot of stuff, even though we should be throwing it away. So there's still more work to do. But we're making progress. And I probably worked on some layout stuff this week, but I forget what it was. If I have to actually look at the Git history to figure out what the heck I was doing, because I'm not good at remembering what I was doing like more than a couple of days ago. Oh yeah, one site I was working on a bit was Knitter. So Knitter is sort of a low fidelity version of Twitter, where you can you can look at people's tweets without loading like the big chunky JavaScript heavy Twitter client. And as of this week, we now render knitr fairly okay. It is missing some stuff like images for profiles, and there's a problem here where you can see like the page is not looking quite right. And I think this is because we don't support CSS box sizing box sizing property. We only support the content box mode, so we don't support border box. And a lot of websites set border box and then like have fairly tight layouts. So they have like, I think this thing here is like 20% and this thing is 80%. And then they have a little bit of border. And then when you combine that with box sizing border box, then it doesn't fit, even though 80 plus 20% should be 100%. It's actually a little bit more because of the borders. Anyway, we do need to implement the borders, the box sizing property for that. But yeah, so when you went to knitr previously, you, at least if I would go to my profile on knitr, it would just show like a big picture of me and everything else was hidden under that picture. So this is definitely progress. And yeah, that's one thing I've been working on this week. So let's see. Carl with the super chat. Thank you so much, Carl. Really appreciate that. I don't know what an $$ is, but thank you very much for the super chat. Let's see. James Pulio says, good time of day, Andreas. Hopefully you got some sponsored tea with you. Of course. I got that Twinings Earl Grey. And now, every time I'm buying Twinings now, by the way, it says on the little package, it says, dang it, I gotta pick that up. It says, by appointment to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. And I'm always looking now, like, are they going to switch this to by appointment to His Majesty Charles? And I feel like I'm holding on to something that will eventually be rare. It's like an original Queen Earl Grey. As I got to keep some of those. But yes, I do have some Twinings Earl Grey here. Let's see. Daniel says, how much do you expect has and container queries will change the architecture of the CSS engine? So I don't think they will change the architecture so much. The main problem with has, I think, is that you need to get better at invalidation. So at the moment, we invalidate very aggressively. Like, anything happens that might invalidate CSS or like might invalidate which selectors apply where, we pretty aggressively just say like, oh, well, something changed. Let's just redo all of the selectors. And has selectors are probably going to be a bit heavier to run. So assuming that they become popular on the web, we need to figure out ways to make them fast. And one of the traditional ways to make selectors faster is to run them less often, which is an obvious strategy, but that's the one that tends to get employed. And we definitely need to be smarter about invalidating so we don't have to do as much work for them. And then I don't know. I was talking to my my old friend and coworker Antti at Apple, who worked on optimizing has selectors in WebKit, and he said that it was quite a challenge to make them fast in WebKit, but they did figure out some ways to do that. So when the time comes, and this is one of our big problems, then at least I know somebody I can ask for ways to make it fast. But truth be told, I have not looked closely at implementing them yet. A naive implementation would not be terribly hard, and I think we should probably do one. there's no reason not to, other than like it's going to be a little slow because you'll have to do a lot of traversal and it'll be heavy, but that's okay. Let's see. Your Fabcat says, do you think it's possible to make a browser that's 4 times faster and lighter, as in less memory and CPU usage, or that's what we have as the tech is so complex? So I think it would be very, very challenging to make a browser that's 4 times faster and 4 times lighter than any of the existing major engines, because the existing engines are already very fast, and a lot of that comes from an extreme investment in JavaScript and optimized JavaScript compilers, and outpacing the production JavaScript VMs in Chrome, Safari, and Firefox by 4x. That would be very expensive. We're going to need a lot of resources for that, or some absolutely groundbreaking novel technique that I don't really have in my back pocket. But when it comes to lighter, that's a different area. And actually one where we have sort of a potential advantage, because if we don't go the path of aggressive JavaScript optimization, but instead opt for something simpler and arguably more secure, at least from my perspective, then it's by definition going to be a lot lighter. At least there will be a lot of potential to make it lighter, since you don't have to run a huge complicated JavaScript compiler pipeline in process. So there is a chance to make something much, much lighter. That's definitely the case. And that's something I'm interested in pursuing for sure. But faster, at least competing with the existing browsers in the same sort of paradigm that they compete with each other, I think we are at a tremendous disadvantage. So we need to find other ways to find an advantage, I guess. Your Fabcat says, also, do you ever have real thoughts about the web tech itself and whether it went wrong and so convoluted already? I don't really have an opinion on that. I think the web is what it is, and I leave it to other people to make the web what it is. I'm not really I'm not here to try to tell anybody how to make their website. I just recognize that the websites are the way they are, and if we want to display them, we have to do certain things. But it's a fascinating thing, a fascinating beast. It's like making a browser is like making an emulator for an architecture that keeps changing every day, and there's like 1 billion ROMs out there to test with. So it's pretty cool. Scriptspin says, how do you see SerenityOS being on one hand a love letter to the 90s, and on the other having to implement all of the modern web standards not available in the 90s to make a browser functional at all? So the love letter to the 90s component is really just specific to the user interface of SerenityOS. It's, I think some people get the idea that like, oh, this is an operating system that constrains itself to like be like a 90s operating system, but that was never my intention. I just wanted something that took the look from the 90s of, you know, Windows 2000, Office 97, sort of that era of software, and just restarted user interface evolution from that point. So like recognizing that, okay, maybe the way that user interfaces evolved after that point is not to my liking. So what if we just reset the clock back to then and start over and see where it evolves if we just take a big step back and then move forward again. So it was never, at least for me, it was never about like turning back the clock on features. So it's perfectly natural to me to support the modern web for what it is. Let's see. Brandon Pruitt says, happy Friday. I'm toying around implementing a routing cache, or a routing cache, I guess, if you're British, As the routing decision gets called on every outward packet, a cache could be referenced instead of calling the decision process repeatedly. However, I don't mean to add complication without any tangible justifications. Ooh, Brandon is a man to my taste. Any thoughts on measuring network performance for this case? Or is this just a silly idea and an unnecessary optimization? Well, I couldn't tell you if it's a silly idea or an unnecessary optimization, but you already have a great intuition about how to figure that out, which is to do the first part, to measure it. So it's undeniably some amount of work that goes into figuring out, making the routing decision for a packet, but you'll want to quantify how much time is spent on that. And you can do that. Maybe you can even do that at like a very, very fine level using the timestamp clock in the CPU. So if you just use like a read TSC or whatever in the kernel to get like here, this thing, this will give you the number of TSC iterations since boot, and then you can do this before and after something you want to measure, and then the difference between those is like, I don't know what to call that number, but I guess colloquially you could say like that's how many cycles it took to do what you want to do, and then at least that will give you some indication of how much time is being spent making that decision. The best way to measure it, I guess, would be to do some kind of high throughput scenario where you're sending a ton of packets. So if you could set up some kind of network test with an Ethernet peer where you're just spamming packets, so that you have to run through the routing machinery over and over and over again for each packet. But the specifics as to how to do that, I'm not sure what would be the best, because I haven't done that kind of thing in many, many years. But yes, please measure. And then it's entirely possible, maybe even likely, that it's a good idea. But it would be really, really good to, at the very least, find a way to measure how much impact the such a thing would have, and learning how to measure network traffic in general. Hey, it's Tim with a super chat. Thank you very much, Tim. Tim says, hello, Andreas. Have you noticed open source software is not a zero-sum game? For example, I spend less time watching TV and playing video games thanks to open source and your inspiration. Keep on inspiring. Thank you very much for saying that, Tim. I have absolutely noticed that open source is not a zero-sum game. Oh wait, let me make sure I didn't scroll by somebody else's super chat. Milan also had a super chat. Thank you very much, saying, today I created my first PR on Serenity. Good opportunity to celebrate it with a super chat. Thank you so much, Milan, for that. Ah, dang. Shamtown with that's a cool symbol. I don't know what that is, but with the super chat saying, thank you for everything. You never stop trying. I try not to stop trying. Oh man, so many super chats. Thank you. Thanks everybody. Yeah, I definitely, Tim, I definitely noticed that open source is not a zero-sum game. And I was also thinking about that in the context of open source funding, actually. Like how GitHub sponsors and things like that are, I don't think that that's a zero-sum game either. Like there seems to me like there's so much undiscovered potential for open source projects to get funding in all kinds of ways, and like we're barely scratching the surface on that thing. Anyways, that's not in the context of what you were saying. It's just something I was thinking about earlier, about a zero-sum game, because it seemed a bit to me like some people might be worried that like there's like a limited pool of potential donors on GitHub sponsors, and they don't want. What am I trying to say? I think that there's more more potential in GitHub sponsors and things like that than we realized. And I think like I'm sponsoring people who work on SerenityOS, for example, and I think that there is a lot more people who might do that. And I think I'm not exactly sure what I'm trying to say. It's like I started this unfinished thought and I don't know where to go with it. So I'm gonna have to take this back to the lab and come back with something smarter later. But thank you all for the super chats. All right, let's try to get back on track. Let's see. Omnicus Liticus was saying, would Serenity be capable of running smoothly on a computer with 32 cores? I don't think so. Not at the moment. In theory, in the future, absolutely. But you know, with more work on our kernel, there is no reason we shouldn't be able to run on 32 cores. There are definitely, like, if you have 32 cores, you're probably going to discover a lot of pain points and a lot of wasted potential where we're not fine-grained enough in our locking. Like, I think a lot of our kernel subsystems are pretty heavy-handed with their synchronization stuff. Let's see. Vishnu was saying, your favorite way to manage memory: garbage collector, shared smart pointers, manual, borrow checker, or AII? I think there's I mean, I don't like manual. Manual definitely out, but there's a time and a place for a garbage collector. Like when you're building a browser engine, a garbage collector is the way to go because the specifications for the web platform all assume that you're using a garbage collector. Because everything is sort of in the context of JavaScript. So in that environment, garbage collector makes sense. Shared and smart pointers, I think, are very, very useful in sort of C++ style UI programs where you have like these well-defined object graphs, but you do need shared ownership of some resources, and you want deterministic destruction order and things like that. And it's just by doing reference counting with smart pointers, then you don't have to deal with a garbage collector coming in and stopping the world at an inopportune time, but you also have like predictable performance and deterministic construction and destruction order. So I do like that in those cases. Borrow checker, I think the borrow checker in Rust is nifty, but the type of programs that I want to write are not really suitable for Rust, at least not in my attempts to do it. And I'd like to think that I had at least some help or input from somebody who was very competent with Rust. And I still ended up feeling like it's not the right language for all programs. I don't have anything against Rust, to be honest. It's just that it's not the right tool for everything. And the way that some people, or so many people, talk about Rust as if it's the right tool for every job, it's a little bit frustrating because I don't think that's intellectually honest to look at any tool that way. And it's just, there's a blindness to the idea that it might not be ideal in every scenario, I guess, which can be frustrating. Anyway, but for programs, for many types of programs, the borrow checker is very, very clever, a very clever technique, and I think it's a fantastic invention, and I'm happy that it exists, and I'm excited to see where it evolves to. But I don't think that it would be my first choice for any of the programs I like to write. And RAII, I would just group under shared and smart pointers. So I think these are all good things, except manual. Manual is, I don't think manual is very good. Memory management technique. Anyway, let's see. Lofty said that they should update it to Charles, but they need to reapply for the license. Oh, they have a license to make the tea for the queen? I assumed that the queen had sort of commissioned them to make the tea, but I have to admit I never looked very closely into how that setup works. Anyway, Shamtown says, are you fluent in Bash or do you need to consult man pages / Google all the time, like me? I generally don't have to consult man pages about shell stuff, except when I want to use like these types of things in shell scripts. You know, like if foo any bar, like I always have to look up the syntax for these things because I can't for the life of me remember correctly how to do that. But I know that if you look up help test, then you get a list of all the operators that you can use and so on. So that is the main thing that I find myself looking up. Sophia says that they're going to replace the label with the kind of tea that Andreas likes to drink. Wouldn't that be nice? And congrats again, Milan, on your first PR. Very cool. Crisscross said, do you want Serenity to compete with established operating systems in the future, or do you see it as a learning journey? I really only care that it competes with existing operating systems with in the market where I am the only customer. So I only want to make it like for me personally, I just care about making something that is good enough for me. But thankfully there are hundreds of other people working on Serenity as well, and they all bring their goals and desires to the project. So there's no telling where we're going to end up. But it's not a goal of mine to try to compete with, you know, like Windows or Mac OS or Linux or anything like that in the market proper. I just want to make something that I like. Premisal says, do you know Gemini? What do you think about it? Oh shoot, I don't think much about it. So for anybody who's not familiar, Gemini is like this simplified web protocol, basically, which is doesn't have JavaScript, but it's like a simple HTML type thing, and there are a bunch of enthusiasts who are really into it, and they want to try and make a simpler web. And you know, I'm happy for people to explore different things, and if you want to read about it, you can find it here. But at the risk of sounding dismissive, these kind of things seem a bit to me like digital nudism, in the sense that it's just a small group of people who are really enthusiastic about living in a way that they think is the right way, and they're not realistically going to convince mainstream users to switch to their way ever, but they have their little colonies where they enjoy themselves, and there's nothing wrong with that. But you know, we can support the Gemini protocol so that you can fetch Gemini links in our browser and stuff like that. I think that's nifty, but I also think that it's like a kind of a nerd. Let's see. Jack Delahunt says, hey, what's your thoughts on modern metaprogramming features that new languages are adding? Rust macros, Zig's comp time, Jai compared to C++ templates, or other languages that use generics? I'm not enough of a language buff to have like detailed opinions on new metaprogramming features. I guess I will say that compile time code execution is very cool, and after messing around with other languages in the last year, it's kind of invigorating to see that there's so much more you can do than what C++ allows you if you have more flexible types of compile time code execution. So it's an area that I find interesting, and for the use cases that I personally care about, like I'm making sure to cover those with Yacht, or but I'm not competent enough in that particular field to have an opinion really worth hearing, I think. Timothy Slater says, are there any other tools you wish that Pixel Paint had that just haven't been implemented yet? Pixel Paint. Let's take a look. I have to context switch into Pixel Paint. I haven't used it for weeks. Immediate feelings about Pixel Paint. Number one, these things here, it's starting to become cluttered. Like I don't care about the histogram and the vector scope in regular use. So they should probably be not on by default. So what I would say is something I would really like to see is a modularization of the tools panel so that you can sort of enable and disable these tool panels, and maybe pop them out into floating windows, pop them into sort of dockable toolbar style UI, because like we're running out of space here, right? And if we keep adding stuff, it's gonna get real cramped. It's already to the point where the layout adjusts a little bit here, yeah, in response to adding something with many properties. So that's what I would say about Pixel Paint. Like the main thing I think feels like the next evolution would be to modularize the whole tool properties area. And for like editing images, text would be a very, very big thing that we don't have any support for at the moment. So just being able to create a text, like a rasterized text, even without anything fancy like a text layer, which would be more like a automatically re-rendered layer. Like just having rasterized text would be a cool thing to have. That's just off the top. Let's see. Sophia says, in the last browser hacking video, you had these solve for X problems. It made me wonder how these could be addressed through a language. Got no mature ideas on the topic though. Yeah, there's probably like some cool language that somebody invented in a university somewhere that like does exactly that with a single symbol, but I don't know either what would be a good way for it. Ein Anton says, hi Andreas, I finally picked up C++ due to your videos, and I really appreciate the SerenityOS source code even more now and regularly use it as a reference. One question that I am thinking about ever since is how you implemented the non-null ref footer in Serenity. Please show us the template magic. Yes, so I gotta go after this, but let's take a look at that one. So non-null ref footer works very similarly to ref footer, but basically it's a template class where you have a template type named T, and internally it just stores a simple raw pointer. But when you're interacting with it, there is like the API is made in such a way that the pointer internally is not allowed to be null. So there's no way to construct it from a raw pointer, for example. And since you can't construct it from a raw pointer, it cannot go into a null state. So you have to construct it from a reference or from another non-null ref footer. There's also this special case here where you adopt a newly constructed object, but even in that case, you still have to provide the newly constructed object as a reference. Non-null ref footer is interesting though, because it does have one special situation where you're using move semantics to move out. So you move from one non-null ref footer object to another. Like here, for example, in the moving assignment operator, then essentially what happens is that the thing that you move from, that non-null ref footer actually becomes null. So that is an unfortunate scenario that we are unable to cover sufficiently with C++. But what we do with that is that it will still error, like it will crash at runtime with a message, like, so it will be like a null dereference at runtime if you try to dereference a moved from non-null ref footer. And I've made attempts in the past to have static analysis detect when you do something bad with those, but that ended up not panning out long term. But I remember I had a blog post about that many years ago on my thing, on my GitHub.io thing. This thing right here. Just link that if somebody might find it interesting. But yeah, so the main thing to know about non-null ref footer is that you can't construct it from a raw pointer. So there's no way to construct one by passing it null footer. But it does have the annoying scenario where you move from one to another, then the moved from one is null internally. But if you try to use it, we will trap you with one of these verify things here. So if it is null and you try to do anything interesting with it at all, it will crash you. And I don't know, maybe that's not exactly what you were looking for, but that's a little bit of stuff about that. Let's see. Okay, so I have to go. So thank you all very much for coming to office hours. And I really appreciate all of the comments, the questions, the super chats. And if you end up working on SerenityOS this weekend, come hang out on Discord with us. And if you don't, then have a great weekend, whatever you do. And I'll see you all next time. Bye.